In a sense, I think there's a good deal of possibility that America is in what might classically be called a pre-revolutionary situation. And then there really might be, sort of dramatic changes in American society that happen only very rarely in the country. In the last 20 or 30 years, really 40 years, there's been a tremendous polarization of wealth in the United States. In other words, most ordinary Americans have shown little, if any, economic improvement in 30 or 40 years, which is unprecedented in American society. In other words, for hundreds of years, Americans had always been more prosperous than their parents, more prosperous than the grandparents. And that stopped about 30 or 40 years ago. So Americans these days, in many cases, are poorer than their parents were. They're poorer than their grandparents were, and are certainly not growing, not doing well economically anymore. While on the other hand, the tiny elite wealthy class of American society, the top 1%, the top 2%, maybe the top 5%, is getting incredibly wealthy by comparison. And there's a widespread feeling that much of that wealth has been acquired parasitically. In other words, it's basically that a tiny section of the American public has been getting much wealthier by really extracting wealth from the rest of the country and making the rest of the country much poorer, which, is the sort of thing that in many countries in the last hundreds of years has led to a revolution. In other words, when you have a tiny elite getting wealthier and wealthier, and the bulk of the population doing worse and worse over time, at some point things might boil over and you might see basically, a violent clash. And so the fact that, that particular executive was assassinated by somebody, outraged over the wealth that he and his company were extracting from the American public. I mean, that's a very dangerous indicator because, the fact that so much of the American public endorsed what he was doing. I mean, there's such a tremendous dissatisfaction over a lot of these corporations, with the healthcare sector being a perfect example of it. In other words, we're talking about basically, I think America spends something like 17 or 18% of its entire GDP on healthcare. And we have some of the worst healthcare results in the world. In other words, the average Chinese person lives longer than the average American. I mean, America is still a much wealthier country, but the Chinese life expectancy is now longer. And, Chinese are much healthier than Americans. They're doing much better than Americans. And the same thing is certainly true of America's European allies. In other words, if you look at, for example, a chart showing the amount of money America is spending on healthcare and the life expectancy, we're diverging from all of our European allies. And so, if we're spending all of this money and we're not getting any results for it, and, ordinary people are sometimes driven into bankruptcy or destroyed economically because their health insurance provider refused to cover the cost of their, services. I mean, that makes people very, very angry. And, I think we're seeing the tip of the iceberg. When you look at, for example, the health problems in the United States, obesity is a gigantic problem. Much of it caused probably because of the lobbying of corporations to encourage the government to support, eating certain food products rather than other food products. And so we're talking about an incredibly corrupt society. I mean, in other words, when you're talking about micro-corruption, in other words, in most parts of the United States, if you get a ticket from the police, you can't bribe the police. If you try that, you'll go to prison. If you try doing, for example, you can't bribe people about zoning permits. America has very little micro-corruption, but it has gigantic macro-corruption. Corruption on the topmost level. Corruption, on, for example, the national security level, with so much of our money going to these defense contractors who, in a sense, are paying off the government official. I mean, right now, America's spending probably $1 trillion a year on defense, and we can't build artillery shells. We don't have the industrial capacity to build artillery shells. I mean, our planes, we're talking about planes that don't fly very well. The F-35 has all sorts of problems, and we've spent $1 trillion a year on defense. So, I mean, that's a perfect example of why, I'm talking about macro corruption. In other words, we're talking about huge sectors of the American economy, the healthcare sector, the defense sector, that are almost entirely controlled by the private enterprises that profit from them and, in effect, control those sectors of the government that are designed to regulate or control them. And so, that's why people are more and more dissatisfied. So much money being spent. I mean, we have gigantic budget deficits, gigantic trade deficits. I mean, there's a very good chance that the dollar in the American economy might collapse, in the foreseeable future. I mean, we're talking about a situation that I think is eerily reminiscent of what America was going through right before the financial collapse of 2008. I think China, Europe, the rest of the world regarded America as having exactly the right financial system to follow. In other words, we were booming, our economy was booming, we had very low employment, very low problems with the economy. In other words, we were doing very well. And it was just a house of mirrors. In other words, basically, a lot of these financial securities that we were issuing, the mortgage-backed securities, basically were houses of cards, and they all collapsed. In other words, we damaged the world economy tremendously because of our financial collapse. And after that, I think China and many other countries in the world became much more cautious about accepting American advice. I would look at, for example, the whole notion of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. I mean, Bitcoin now, I think it's up to like $1 trillion or $2 trillion of market value. It's basically, by most reasonable standards, it's a Ponzi scheme. In other words, it has no intrinsic value. The only reason it's considered valuable is that people are trading it back and forth. And some people have certainly become incredibly wealthy by trading Bitcoin, but it has no underlying value. And it absorbs tremendous amounts of energy from the United States and the rest of the world in terms of processing Bitcoins, mining Bitcoin. And at some point, the whole thing might suddenly collapse, which probably would cause a very deep recession in the United States. And so, that's the problem. In other words, if all these people who have been trading meme stocks that have no value, who've been trading, for example, stocks that are driven a stock market bubble, who've been basically trading Bitcoin with each other, if suddenly they lose all of their financial assets, America might see tremendous social upheaval of a sort we haven't seen for generations before. In a sense, I think there's a good deal of possibility that America is in what might classically be called a pre-revolutionary situation. In other words, there's such tremendous dissatisfaction across the country, dissatisfaction that's been spread for 10 or 20 years. I mean, again, more and more people are so suspicious of events of the past. And, it's because people basically don't believe the government acts in their own interests. They don't believe the government is honest. And that's why they voted for Donald Trump. I mean, they voted for Donald Trump in some cases because they supported Donald Trump, but in many other cases because they hated the enemies of Donald Trump, the American establishment. And that's why if Donald Trump is much less successful than many of them hope, if he ends up going back on many of his promises, if he ends up doing things that they feel betray them one more time, that might be the final straw. And then there really might be, sort of dramatic changes in American society that happen only very rarely in the country. Because, so many American people are just so incredibly fed up with so many things that have happened over the last 5 or 10 or 20 years that, it's not a healthy situation for our society.
偷偷告诉大家，我最近发现了新法宝 Royal Face 逆时奇迹系列，它有活肤露、全效精华，还有精华霜。尤其我皮肤比较偏干，所以我非常的注重保湿。保湿做得好，肌肤自然烹润。提亮肤色更年轻，抚平皱纹超有感，而且气色变好，用心保养，每天都更美一点。美吧。